Welcome to Chromaticus. Today we're going to talk about non-chord tones and how composers used to treat dissonance in melodic writing. You might think it's not worth using these techniques anymore because you're a modern composer and we don't really follow the rules that they did in the Baroque era and the Classical period. But I think there's two really good reasons why you should learn these techniques. The first reason is because if you want to create your own unique style of music, I think the easiest way is to take different elements from different periods of time and different parts of the world and kind of put them all together in your own unique way. The second reason is because if you're a film composer or writing music for a play, you need to know the techniques that they use in that time period and that part of the world to kind of evoke that sense of you're in this time period in this place. We're going to look at how composers used to treat non-chord tones and dissonance using two-part counterpoint as an example. Let's first start with the very basic framework of two-part counterpoint, or simply melody and bass line. Because there's no independence of rhythm in the two lines, they're just heard as one unified idea or unified texture. It's a pretty boring, straightforward sound, but we're going to spice it up in a second. Now we have two unique melodic lines working together simply from adding non-chord tones and creating unique rhythmic ideas. This time it sounds a lot more musical. So how do we get from this very basic framework here to a fully complete idea like this? First, let's go through all the different non-chord tone possibilities, and then I'll sort of walk you through what I did. On our list of non-chord tone possibilities, the first one is passing tones. These are notes that fill in the gaps between two chord tones, and they appear on a weak beat or a weak portion of a beat. They approach and resolve in the same direction. Next we have neighbor tones. This is a decoration or an embellishment of a note by playing the note above or the note below and then returning to the original note. Next we have suspension. This is where you take a chord tone and hold it over top of a change of harmony and then resolve downward by step on the weak beat or a weak portion of a beat. You could also have a retardation, which is the same thing except it resolves upward by step. Next we have anticipations, which occur on a weak beat or a weak portion of a beat, and it's essentially just a note that arrives early, so it's a chord tone of the very next chord. Next we have escape tones. These are approached by step, but resolved by a leap of a third in the opposite direction. They are usually found on a weak beat or a weak portion of a beat. Next we have Appoggiatura, which are accented notes approached by leap and resolved by step in the opposite direction. When I say accented, what I mean is that it's approached on the strong portion of a beat and then actually resolves on the weak portion of a beat. So it's the opposite of what we've seen so far. Next, we have incomplete neighbor tones. These approach by leap and resolve by step in the opposite direction, similar to an Appoggiatura, except this one resolves on the strong portion of a beat. Next we have Cambiatas, which are notes that are approached by step, then leap a third in the same direction, and then finally resolve by a step back in the opposite direction. So now if we go back to our original example here and start to add some non-chord tones, you can see how it starts to sound a little bit more like music. I've added some passing tones, I have an accented passing tone, some neighbor tones, an escape tone, an incomplete neighbor tone, an appoggiatura. So I've used quite a few of them, but I didn't use every single one. Just remember that trying to use every single non-chord tone in a piece of music, especially just a small 8-bar phrase, is more of an academic exercise. You're probably in most cases not going to use more than 3 or 4 at a time. And passing tones and neighbor tones are the most common. Let's take a listen to the piece now with the non-chord tones. Now that we've covered non-chord tones, you can start to use them in some of your own music. And it doesn't have to be counterpoint. It could be harmony plus melody, or you just use these techniques in your melodic line and maybe your counter melody. But I want to go over one more technique that I think is really interesting and kind of fits really well with this idea, and that's imitation. Imitation can be anything from a strict, rule-based repetition such as a canon or a sequence, to a very loose imitation of an idea such as repeating the exact rhythmic structure of a motif in a different voice while using different notes or changing the intervals. This will help keep your compositions cohesive by having multiple lines play either exact repeats or variations of a single motif. The first example is a literal imitation. The motif plays in the first voice and is then repeated exactly the same way in the lower voice, except it's down an octave, or in this case, down 2 octaves. The second example is a sequence. It's the same motif, just modulated up or down to a different chord. In my example, I modulated up a whole step from the F minor to a G major chord. In the final example, we have an imitation that is modified. You can use really any type of modifications that you want. In this case, I used some inversions and also a change of harmony. After adding the non-chord tones and getting to this step here, you can start to see now how I got to this final step down here with the imitations. I started to refine my ideas a little bit and add some different rhythmic values in here. So I took this idea in the lower voice here, I put it in the upper voice down here, and then I used an inversion. The inversion's quite simple. Here I went down a second, up a second, up a second, and in the inversion I went up a second, down a second, down a second. I used another imitation right here and an inversion again. So I just kept kind of refining ideas and adding little imitations until I was finally satisfied with the piece. There you have non-chord tones and imitation. I'm going to attach a little PDF down below that you can use as a study guide that has everything we covered today, so check that out if you need it. That's going to do it for us today. Keep studying, keep practicing, keep growing. See you next time.